Have you ever felt truly, completely alone? Not just lonely, but isolated in a way that makes you realize how fragile your safety really is. A story sent to me recently made me think about that. It came from a guy named Mark, who spent one winter in the Rockies that changed him forever. This isn't a ghost story. There are no monsters, at least not the supernatural kind. It's about a job, a remote cabin, and a delivery that shouldn't have happened. In the winter of 2018, Mark was broke and desperate. He answered an ad online. Caretaker needed for remote mountain property. 4 months of solitude, good pay. The employer was a private company that rented out luxury cabins. His job was simple: keep the pipes from freezing, run the generators, and maintain the security system. He'd be alone, with a supply drop every 2 weeks. He was flown in by helicopter to a cluster of 3 massive, modern cabins, nestled in a valley so deep the sun only hit it for a few hours a day. The main cabin was his base. The other 2 were locked, waiting for clients who never came in the dead of winter. His only link to the outside world was a satellite phone for emergencies and a weekly check-in call. The first month was fine, peaceful even. He read books, watched the snow pile up, and felt like he was getting paid to be a hermit. The supply drops came like clockwork. A small plane would buzz the valley and drop a reinforced crate on a parachute near the clearing. Then in late January, the blizzard started, one after another. The weekly check-in calls became brief. His employer sounded increasingly stressed, talking about logistical issues. The scheduled supply drop came a week late. The crate was lighter than usual. Less food, no new books, just the essentials. A note inside simply said, "Tight month, make it last." Weeks passed. The silence grew heavier. His food was running dangerously low. He tried to ration, but the constant cold demanded calories. The next supply drop just didn't come. The satellite phone rang only once, his boss, voice clipped, saying, "Weather's grounded everything. Hold tight, 2 more weeks." Mark was now scared, not just of hunger but of the silence. The emptiness of the other cabins began to feel oppressive. One night during a lull in the storms, he saw lights, not from the sky but from the largest of the locked cabins. A faint, warm glow in the windows. He was sure they were empty. The security system, which he monitored, hadn't been triggered. Fear turned to a desperate, crawling dread. Someone was in there, and they hadn't come through the front gate. The next morning, he did something he knew was against the rules. He took the master key and went to the cabin. The door was unlocked. Inside, it was spotless, warm, and fully stocked. The fridge was full of food. The pantry was loaded. In the living room, a fire was still smoldering in the fireplace, but there was no one. And then he saw the basement door. It was always supposed to be locked with a separate, heavy padlock. The lock was on the floor, cut clean through. The stairs led down into a cold, concrete-walled space. It wasn't a wine cellar. It was a storage room, and it was filled with rows of industrial white freezers, humming quietly. They weren't on his power grid. They had their own dedicated generator buried in a shed outside. His first stupid thought was, "They've been stockpiling food out here." He opened the lid of the nearest freezer. It wasn't food. Wrapped in thick, clear plastic, suspended in ice, were distinct organic shapes. He saw what looked like a hand, then a mass of dark hair. He slammed the lid shut, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't a rental property. It was a storage facility, a cold, remote, anonymous storage facility for things, for people that needed to disappear. He ran back to his cabin, paralyzed with terror. What did he just see? Who was his employer? The people in the freezers, were they victims, or were they inventory? The answer came that evening. The distant thrum of a helicopter, not the small supply plane. It landed right by the occupied cabin. Through his binoculars, he saw two men in dark winter gear unload several large, heavy duffel bags from the helicopter and carry them inside. They worked with a cold, efficient routine. This was a delivery, a new delivery. Mark realized his own role. He wasn't a caretaker. He was a decoy, a legitimate-looking presence to explain any activity to keep the real operation hidden. If anyone ever got curious, they'd see Mark, the harmless caretaker. They wouldn't look twice at the locked cabins, and if the operation was ever compromised, he was the only loose end, alone in the wilderness. He had to get out, now. He couldn't wait for a supply drop. He packed a backpack with the little food he had, his sleeping bag, and a knife. He had one advantage. He knew the terrain from his boredom walks. There was an old Forestry Service road, buried under feet of snow, that led to a ranger station over 20 miles away. He left in the dead of night during a fresh snowfall to cover his tracks. He didn't take the satellite phone. He was sure it was being tracked. For 3 brutal days, he fought through deep snow and biting wind, surviving on melted snow and sheer adrenaline. He finally stumbled into the ranger station, half frozen and delirious. The rangers called the police. Mark told them everything. But when a sheriff's helicopter finally reached the property 2 days later, the cabins were empty, cleaned out. The freezers were gone. The basement was just a damp concrete room. No evidence. Nothing. The company that hired him had a legitimate front, but the office address led to a vacant lot in another state. The official report called it a case of extreme isolation-induced paranoia. Mark's statements were dismissed as the hallucinations of a man suffering from hunger and cabin fever. No bodies, no crime scene, no proof. But Mark knows what he saw, and he knows the most terrifying part of the story isn't what was in those freezers. It's that they are still out there operating, somewhere else, in another remote, beautiful, frozen place, and they'll need a new caretaker, someone desperate, alone, and disposable. So if you ever see an ad for a job that seems too good to be true, in a place no one can hear you, remember Mark's winter. This story was sent to me by a viewer named David. He asked me to share it, but not to use his real name or location. All he said was that it happened a few winters ago, somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. David worked as a seasonal caretaker for a remote, privately owned research outpost. It wasn't a huge facility, just a 2-story main lodge with a generator shed, a radio mast, and a few outbuildings, buried deep in a mountain forest. His job was simple. Check in once a week from November to April, make sure the pipes hadn't burst, the generator was fueled, and that no squatters had broken in. The owners paid well for this simple duty. The first few visits were uneventful. He'd drive up the long, unplowed forestry road on his snowmobile, spend an hour doing his rounds in the silent, frozen buildings, and head back. The place always felt a little lonely, a little too quiet, but that was just the isolation. His 4th visit was different. It was late January, during one of those heavy, windless snowfalls where the world goes muffled and gray. As he was checking the main lodge, he found something odd in the downstairs hallway. A single, wet boot print. Not from a winter boot, it looked like a worn-out work boot, the kind you'd wear in a garage. And it was melting. Fresh. His heart jumped. He was supposed to be alone. He called out. No answer. He checked every room, every closet, the basement, nothing. The doors were all still locked from the outside, the windows sealed. The only prints in the deep snow outside were his own, leading from the shed to the lodge. He convinced himself he'd somehow tracked it in himself, though his own boots were covered in snow and looked nothing like the print. The next week, the feeling of wrongness was stronger. The boot print was gone, of course, but in the upstairs office, the chair behind the desk was pulled out as if someone had been sitting there, and on the dusty surface of the desk, a faint, clean streak, like an arm had been rested there, brushing the dust away. Again, a thorough search revealed no one. The radio in the lodge, which was usually dead, crackled once with a burst of static that sounded like a faint, distorted breath. He left an hour early, telling himself it was the old building settling, the wind. His next scheduled visit was 2 weeks later due to a storm. By the time he got there, the dread had built into a solid knot in his stomach. This time, he found something that erased all doubt. In the generator shed next to the humming machine was a small, makeshift camp. A thin sleeping bag rolled out on the concrete floor. A few empty canned food tins cleaned out with a spoon, a plastic water bottle, and a small, cheap notebook. David didn't touch anything at first. He just stared. Someone was living here, but how? The road was impassable by car, no other snowmobile tracks. He radioed the local ranger station, but the signal was dead. The storm must have damaged the mast. He was alone with this discovery. He picked up the notebook. The first few pages were just dates, temperatures, notes on the generator's fuel level, mimicking his own caretaker logs. Then the entries changed. December 12. He came today, did his rounds, didn't look up. January 8. He saw the print. He was scared. He talks to himself. January 15. He sat in the office. I was in the wall. He didn't know. David's blood turned to ice in the wall. He remembered the layout of the upstairs. There was a long, narrow linen closet. He checked it every time. He ran back to the lodge up the stairs and yanked open the closet door. It was just shelves. He knocked on the back wall. It sounded hollow. Feeling along the edges, his fingers found a hidden catch. A section of the shelving unit swung inward silently, revealing a dark, cramped space. A maintenance access shaft running the length of the building, full of pipes and wires. And there on the floor of the shaft was more evidence. Food wrappers, another water bottle, a small flashlight. That's when he heard it, a soft thud from downstairs. Then another, not footsteps, something being placed on the floor methodically. David froze, trapped in the upstairs hallway. The sounds were coming from the main entryway. Thud, thud. He crept to the top of the stairs and looked down. His snowmobile suit, helmet, and gloves, which he'd left in a pile by the front door, were now arranged in a neat line on the floor. The helmet was placed upright, the gloves positioned beside it, the suit laid out flat, as if someone was preparing them, or as if they were displaying a set of clothes that would no longer be needed. Then from the kitchen down the hall, a new sound, the distinct, slow scrape of a chair being pulled out from a table. David didn't wait to see more. He bolted. He ran down the stairs, leapt over the arranged clothes, and fumbled with the deadbolt. He burst out into the blinding snow, wearing just his sweater and jeans. He didn't go to his snowmobile. It was parked by the shed, too far. He just ran. He crashed into the forest, the snow soaking him to the waist, the cold biting his face. He ran until his lungs burned, following the drainage ditch beside the road, knowing it would eventually lead to the main highway. He didn't look back. He was found hours later, half frozen, by a highway patrolman clearing a blocked intersection. The official report called it a hypothermia-induced hallucination. The rangers who later investigated the outpost found the hidden shaft, the camp in the shed. They found the notebook, but they found no one. The theory was a transient had broken in before the first heavy snows, gotten trapped, and was using the facility to survive. They assumed David's arrival had scared the person off for good. David doesn't believe that. He thinks the person wasn't trapped. He thinks they were established. They knew the building's secrets. They were observing him, learning his routine, waiting. For what, he doesn't know. He never went back. He sold his snowmobile and moved to a city. The part that haunts him the most, he wrote, isn't the boot print or the notes. It's the arranged clothes. It was a message. It meant, I've been close enough to touch your things. I know what you came in, and you won't be needing them to leave. The latest story for today is from a woman named Anna. It's about her grandparents' house, the secret her mother kept, and one winter when everything came out. Anna's mother, Helen, inherited the old family house in a remote part of Maine after her own mother passed. Helen had a strange, strained relationship with the place. She never spent holidays there as a kid, and when Anna asked about her grandparents, Helen would change the subject. But the house was valuable, so they decided to sell it. To get it ready, they moved in for the month of January between Christmas and the spring market. The house was a big Victorian-era place, all dark wood and creaky floors, surrounded by dense, snow-covered pines. It felt more like a museum than a home. Cold air seemed to seep from the walls. Helen's behavior changed as soon as they arrived. She became jumpy, insisted on locking every door and window twice, and kept the heavy curtains in the living room drawn at all times, even during the day. She said it was to keep the heat in, but she kept staring at those curtains like she was waiting for something outside to move. The first strange thing was the furnace room, in the basement. Helen refused to go down there. The old oil furnace was acting up and Anna's husband, Mike, volunteered to check it. When he came back up, he was pale. He said it wasn't just the furnace down there. One wall was different from the others. It was made of newer, unpainted cinder blocks, sealed tight with modern mortar. It looked like a small room had been sealed off, maybe a decade or two ago. When Anna asked her mother about it, Helen froze. Then she snapped, saying it was probably just an old cold storage her father had built, and it was none of their business. Her reaction was too sharp, too scared. A few days later, during a blizzard that knocked out the power, they were huddled by the fireplace. The wind was howling like an animal. In a moment of quiet, Helen, staring into the flames, whispered something Anna almost didn't catch. He always said he'd come back with the first big snow. When Anna pressed her, Helen shut down completely. Forget I said anything. It's just an old saying. But Anna couldn't forget. She started noticing other things. Scratches on the inside of the back door's deadbolt. A small, rusted old dog tag she found in a kitchen drawer, not for a dog, but with the name Jonas stamped on it. Her mother had no siblings. Her grandfather's name was Robert. Her curiosity turned to a low-grade dread. She waited until her mother was in the shower and searched her old suitcase. Buried under clothes, she found a small, locked metal box. It was the kind you'd keep important papers in. Anna, with a sinking feeling, managed to pick the simple lock. Inside were no papers. There was a faded Polaroid of a young man, smiling, leaning against a truck. On the back, in her mother's teenage handwriting, Jonas, July 78. And underneath the photo, a single yellowed newspaper clipping from October 1979. The headline read, "Local man missing, foul play suspected." The man's name was Jonas Richter. He was last seen arguing with local contractor Robert Miller, Anna's grandfather over an unpaid debt. The article said the case went cold. No body, no evidence. Jonas just vanished. Anna felt the world tilt. Her sweet, quiet grandfather, who she'd met only a few times as a small child before he died of a heart attack. A contractor. Someone who would know how to build a wall. The next day, with the power still out and her mother in a distant, quiet mood, Anna went down to the basement. Mike had left his tools by the new wall. She took a heavy hammer and a cold chisel. She didn't think. She just started tapping at the mortar in one corner where it met the old foundation. It was hard work, but the mortar was brittle with age. After an hour, she dislodged one cinder block. The hole was dark. A smell wafted out, not decay but dry, dusty cold and something metallic, like old tools. She shone her flashlight inside. It wasn't a room. It was a narrow space, maybe 4 feet deep, and leaning against the old stone foundation, slumped in a seated position, was a skeleton. It was still dressed in the faded remains of denim and a plaid shirt. A few strands of dark hair clung to the skull, and around its neck on a thin chain was a rusted dog tag. She couldn't bring herself to read it. She didn't scream. She just sat there on the cold floor, the flashlight beam shaking in her hand. The howling wind outside sounded different now. It didn't sound like weather. It sounded like an answer. She carefully pushed the block back. She went upstairs, washed her hands, and said nothing. When the roads cleared, Anna and Mike packed their things. They told Helen the house was too much work. The market was bad, they'd deal with it later. Helen just nodded, looking relieved to be leaving. They drove back to the city in silence. A week later, Anna anonymously called the tip line for the county sheriff's office in Maine. She reported suspected human remains in the basement of the old Miller property, citing renovation work. She used a payphone. She never told her mother what she found. She knew Helen had lived with that secret since she was a teenager. Knew that her grandfather had not just been a quiet man, but a murderer who'd buried his crime in his own basement, and his wife and daughter had covered it up out of fear or loyalty or both. The house was seized as a crime scene. A body was found. The cold case was reopened. It made local news for a week. Anna followed it online, her stomach in knots. They identified the remains as Jonas Richter. The investigation pointed to Robert Miller, long deceased. Case closed. Anna and her mother never spoke about it. The secret now lived between them, a wall thicker than cinder blocks. Sometimes Anna wonders which is worse, the horror of finding what she found, or the understanding of the quiet, desperate life her mother had lived, guarding that hidden room for over 40 years. The house still stands empty. No one will buy it. And Anna thinks in a way her grandfather did come back with the snow, not in person, but his crime finally saw the light in the dead of winter.